Good evening and welcome to everyone on Zoom and social media to our second mayoral debate. Tonight, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Zack Polanski, who is the Green candidate for the London Assembly West Central constituency. The Green Party mayoral candidate, Sian Berry, has asked Zack to represent her this evening. Zack is on the Jewish Green Executive and a rising star in the London Party. My conversation with Sean Bailey of the Conservatives last week is online. Next Monday, I shall be in conversation with Louisa Porritt, that's Monday, who is the Liberal Democrat candidate. And an invitation has been extended to Sadiq Khan, and we are yet hopeful. I'm keen to know more about the leadership voices in our community and those seeking responsibility for our city, its environment and infrastructure. I'm interested in those who express positions for or from diverse traditions and whose religious values underpin their platform. I'm also keen to include your questions and comments and invite you to submit those through the chat. There are 25 London Assembly members who you elect at the same time as the mayor. 11 represent the whole capital and 14 are elected by constituencies. Zack is third on the Green Party list. The Greens currently have 2 Assembly members. He's worked as an actor, communications trainer, counsellor and youth worker in schools and universities. In the 2019 parliamentary election, Zack ran for the Green Party in the cities of London and Westminster constituency, which was a Conservative hold for Nikki Aiken. Before joining the Greens, Zack was a member of the Lib Dems. Zack is a committed campaigner for safer streets and cleaner air. Along with fellow Greens, he's been a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion and marching in solidarity with the school strikers and those who say no to a third runway at Heathrow. Zack has campaigned for young, vulnerable EU workers to be paid in the hospitality industry and is one of the founding directors of the Save the Black Cap campaign, which successfully fought off a planned sale of a popular LGBT+ space from being turned into luxury flats. In a challenging and occasionally patronizing interview on LBC by Andrew Castle, he was described as an articulate speaker and likable, passionate young man. Ian Dale lists Zack as one of his top political tweeters in 2020. Zack reflects, therefore, that there is a niche market for Greens with right-wing shock jocks. Zack says, and I paraphrase a little, "I'm obsessed with environmental justice and social justice, and we should all be obsessed because our planet is on the line." Good evening and welcome, Zack.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Rabbi.
So your journey to the London Assembly starts in Manchester. You grew up there in the Orthodox community. So tell us a little bit about your background.
That's right. And thank you for that introduction. It was amazing to hear some recent past all come flooding at me. I should say for context, although you did say you're paraphrasing, I was asked, am I obsessed with climate change? I don't generally go around telling people I'm obsessed, although the answer was certainly completely accurate. Yeah, I grew up in Manchester. I went to King David, so there was a pretty obvious start there for a Jewish boy. I went to Cheder regularly, and then I did the very typical thing, which I'm ashamed to admit in front of a rabbi, but I turned 13, bar mitzvahed, and then didn't keep going to synagogue as regularly as I should do. I am, however, very culturally Jewish. And I think in the past few years, particularly around my political activism, that has reawoken a love and pride of my Jewish heritage and actually of how we look after our world. And I'm sure most people on this call and listening on Facebook or on YouTube will be aware of Tikkun Olam, so the idea of mending the world. And I think it's there that Jewishness and environmentalism intersects. And I think a lot of that comes from early beginnings in Manchester, but of course, much more recently as well, in adventures in politics.
So you attended a Jewish school, but you were against faith schools.
Yeah, so I actually, we spoke earlier about faith schools, and I said that the Green Party policy was to abolish faith schools. I've realized that I've gone in far too hard, and actually that is not Green Party policy. Green Party policy is that there shouldn't be public spending on faith schools. However, I still said it to you and I still stand by it, and I'll explain why. So I went to a faith school, and I think I would have had a much more rounded education had I been able to learn about my Jewish heritage privately or even in school but also if I'd learned a bit more about Christianity, about Islam, about other religions from around the world. And I think when we box people too much, I think that means that whether we're Jewish or whatever we might be, we sometimes lose a connection with other cultures. And I almost find it odd because in our Jewish community, I feel like we have so much emphasis on community, on reaching out, on understanding the other. Our story, the Jewish story of passing through Egypt, is a story about overcoming oppression, about fleeing slavery. And I think so many of these stories are embedded in other cultures too. So I'm just cautious about the idea that children should just learn one faith and that should be the only way. I am, however, deeply proud of my Jewish education. And I think for things like Holocaust education, for instance, it makes me really sad that I have to say this, because I think it should be pretty obvious that the Holocaust is important, and even feel like I have to say that it happened in some spaces. And that is deeply worrying for future generations. So when we talk about things like Holocaust education and our Jewish story, it's massively important that money and time and effort is invested to make sure that story reaches everyone, but not just Jewish students. That story needs to go across the world.
So look, I went to a Church of England based school, and it's generated a fair number of rabbis. So there's definitely the opportunity to pick up on your faith and become an activist within the religion from a secular or from a separate faith-based school. But I've chosen to send my kids to Jewish schools because I had to spend my life playing catch up on the Jewish education and quality of Jewish education that I could have got had I attended a Jewish school. I have to be very careful. My mother is on the line, but also are people who are on the who are at the same school as me. So I've got all perspectives here watching. I missed out on getting the Jewish education that I could have got, and there was no way that in the West End Cheder once or twice a week I would have been able to learn Talmud to the extent that the kids who are going to Jewish schools are able to have. And that applies to Jews and to Muslims, Hindus, people from all sorts of faith backgrounds. And surely part of being in a culturally respectful environment, we should be able to nurture the very best of religious or ethnic education at the same time as mandating, and I'm very happy to do that, mandating opening up to exploring and discovering other faiths.
I think that's a really fair challenge. And I think that partly answers the gulf in the question. Because I think, yes, we shouldn't be banning anything. And I think, to give you an example back, after I went to King David, I went to a secular sixth form. I say it was secular. They would have Christian prayers in the morning. And there was about 12 Jewish students. And the 12 Jewish students, including myself, would leave the secular prayers, Christian prayers, and we would go to another room where we would debate. And that was interesting because there was no kind of formal Jewish education. There was no formal kind of, we are Jewish, so we're doing this together. We just happen to be Jewish. But there's something about Judaism and debate that is inextricably linked. And every single day, one of us would have to prepare a debate that we were going to have on any topic. And I very specifically remember the teacher saying that no topic was out of bounds. So that meant sometimes people would really, really push the edge of, what could be debated. But I have no doubt that so much of my political beginnings, my radicalism, my common sense, and those two things can be in balance, all come from that space where I was allowed to be with fellow Jewish students talking about things that are going on in the world. I just think, and I think where the nuance really needs to be, is that where you do have faith schools, if they're privately funded, I think there does need to be a commitment to LGBT issues, for instance. And I say that as a gay man, but I'd like to think that I would say that anyway. And also to the national curriculum. And I don't just mean that for Judaism, but there's other religions where the national curriculum may come into conflict with some of the core beliefs. And I think it's important that there is a balance between our religious beliefs and the stories that we've been told, and also science and evolution and all of those things. Now, I know a priest in East London, Vaughan Williams. He's a Reformed priest. And I spoke to him once about storytelling, because I'm an actor, storytelling in the Bible. And I remember very specifically saying, aren't these just stories? And don't we put too much faith in these stories? And he just replied that it very much depends on the storyteller and how much faith you have in the storyteller. And I think all of these things are true. And what I think we really need to be instilling in our children and our students is that love of curiosity, that love of questioning, And I won't be too bold to show off my religious education in front of a rabbi, but we're coming up to Pesach and we have the 4 questions, which off memory is the wise one, I hate the phrase simple one, so I'll go with the ignorant one, the wise one, the simple one, the wicked one. And then you've got the one who doesn't know how to ask questions. And I remember always being fascinated by that as a teenager. Why is it that they don't know how to ask questions, and how do you learn to ask questions? And I think if we could do more of that in our religious and secular education, we'd have a better society around.
So you've raised a couple of really good points on that. I don't want to be patronizing there. You've raised some really important points which are of interest to me. And that is, you talked about going off as the Jewish group, and in contemporary conversation, the need for safe spaces is really important. And people need to be able to huddle or caucus or exchange within themselves. And that's part of growth. But you also said no topic should be out of bounds or off limits. We're living in an environment of cancel culture where people are very frightened to express themselves. Do you really believe that in the public space, no topic should be out of bounds?
I think no topic should be out of bounds, but the intention and the way that topic is discussed certainly does need limits. So to give one example, the Jewish Greens today have just co-written an open letter to Bristol University about David Miller and his anti-Semitic remarks. I think there comes a point where people should be allowed to discuss things. They should certainly be allowed to discuss Israel, as they should be allowed to discuss Saudi Arabia or Yemen or any country in any state. But there then is definitely a point where it's moved into anti-Semitism and it's moved into hate speech. How you define that line, I'm not going to pretend is easy, and that is always going to be a difficult conversation. But I think ultimately you have to use a precautionary principle. And if what you are saying is likely to cause deep offense to a community, then 1, you should find a different way to say it. And 2, if you can't find a different way to say it, you need to listen and engage with that community and then find how they would like you to express your opinion. So there's a real distinction here between it's important to have debates and it's important to discuss things, but it's also important to show love, compassion, and kindness, even with the people you disagree with. And I think if there's anything massively missing from our politics and our civic life, superficially, is love and kindness. I do think there's a lot of love and kindness in community groups, and we've seen that during the pandemic with the WhatsApp group and the mutual aid groups. But I was really struck with Sean last week, and I don't want to start finger pointing because I'll be doing the exact opposite of what I'm about to say, but he was just really personal about Sadiq Khan. Now, I disagree with a massive amount of what Sadiq Khan's doing, and he is not my mayor of London in terms of he's not the mayor I would want. But there's things about Sadiq that I think we should celebrate. I think the fact that we were the first city with a Muslim mayor, I think is something as another marginalised and vulnerable community to be able to say that's fantastic that we had a Muslim mayor of London. But I think at the same time, there's no need to be really personal when we disagree with people, and actually we should play the ball and not the man or the woman.
I think that's absolutely fair. So where do the Greens stand, just or you and the Jewish group within the Greens stand on the international definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRC definition?
Right, so it's been a long process. I'm going to caveat this. It's not a justification, but it is a caveat that we were the first party in 2008 out of any of the parties to have a definition of hate crime and anti-Semitism within our policy. So I think we were already leading on this before the other parties. Then the Jeremy Corbyn stuff happened. And by the Jeremy Corbyn stuff, I'm sure people on this call are well aware of the vitriol and the discussion. And I don't think we should particularly have a discussion tonight about whether Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitic or not, because I think it's almost a mute subject at this moment. He's gone from frontline politics. But I think we can all agree without a doubt that there was conversation around Jeremy Corbyn that was certainly anti-Semitic, and he certainly enabled some anti-Semites and gave them platforms. So Jeremy Corbyn was problematic for our community in all sorts of ways. And then I think the IHRA became politicized. It became this kind of almost referendum on Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that's been deeply unhelpful and still is to this day. Having said all of that, my personal position is that although I think there's some issues with the IHRA, I don't think it's a perfect definition. It is the definition that I would say our mainstream Jewish community stands by. And as a Jewish politician in the Green Party, that is a definition I want to stand by, because I want to send a very clear signal as does Sean Berry, incidentally, and all the leadership of the Greens. They've said several times on record that they stand in full solidarity with the Jewish community, and they want to see this definition into our policy. Now, the place where this is tricky is the other parties kind of have sometimes this facade of democracy, whereas the Green Party, for all I love them, are truly democratic. So it is one member, one vote. And that's fantastic. But what it means is it sometimes takes a long time to get policy through, because literally every single line of our policy has to be debated, signed off, and then come to a conference where it's voted for or against. Now, what we've done with the IHRA is we've recognized that there's been all of these problems going on in the wider Jewish community. And what we tried to do is improve on it. And what I mean by improve on it is include it in full, so there's no diluting here, but also side by side with it, have several other definitions by leading Jewish academics that say this is a range of what it is to be Jewish, and this is a range of examples that are anti-Semitic. And the way that I've been able to present this is not only does this protect the Jewish community, which is obviously vital to me, it also protects people who say that the IHRA gives an excuse for people to accuse people of anti-Semitism that aren't anti-Semitic. Now, I think there's a valid concern there. It's not one that I necessarily agree with happens a lot, but I do think the definition has loopholes where someone can be accused of anti-Semitism where it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. So I think we've come with this quite nuanced and detailed approach, which actually says, you look at the IHRA, you look at these other definitions, you look at what said person has said and done, and then the disciplinary committee makes a wise decision. Now, just explaining this to you, this has taken a long time. And I am actually proud, though, that I think the Green Party have demonstrated its values of commitment, of collaboration, of listening to the Jewish community, but also making sure that we've kept a commitment to free speech as long as it doesn't verge into hate crime. And I'm really pleased to say that I believe at the next conference coming, this should be on the agenda, and this should be something we should be voting through. Now, I'm not complacent about this. I wish I could sit here and say, I got this voted on just last month or 2 months ago, because there's lots of other things I want to be doing in politics and lots of other things I want to be talking about. And I feel like we've been talking about this definition for far too long. But actually, every time that it has come up at an earlier event before the big conference, people have been widely in support. There have been issues and there have been concerns, but largely through conversations, one-on-one or small groups, I've managed to deal with those concerns, and more people have come on board. So we will pass it, and it will have full support. And actually, I think that's been a more grown-up way than some of the other parties. So the Lib Dems, for instance, just adopted it, and they didn't have a conversation about it. Now, I realize that's great in some ways for our Jewish community, and I do support someone just saying, we stand with the Jewish community, so we've passed this. But then they've run into problems later on in the line because they haven't gone through that long, arduous process of taking people with them. And I think what we're doing in the Green Party is taking people with us. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it was a long question.
That was long, but it also demonstrated that you are a very natural political communicator. And I want to go back, because before you were interested in political communication, your real passion was to be an actor. What was it about acting that captivated you? And what was it about acting that took you to America?
So really good question. You put it in the past tense, but I would still say acting is my biggest passion. I enjoy politics most of the time. I enjoy it when we're getting things done. There's certainly days where I think, just want to go back to acting. I wish it would all go away. But actually, I think the two things are interlinked. So I was working as an actor, and I was doing more and more political theatre. Initially, I was looking particularly at Shakespeare, and I was studying in Wales. And then I went to America, because something about my 21-year-old self said that if you want to be a Shakespearean actor, you should leave the UK and go to Atlanta, Georgia, into the deep south. When I met casting directors, they were a bit puzzled about why I had come all the way to be a Shakespearean actor in America. But actually, I think that helped formulate ideas of why I was in America and what I wanted to do with my life. And I realized the things I really loved about Shakespearean plays, and still do, is how much back then he was already pushing what the norms of society are and asking some deep and difficult questions. And I think in those Shakespearean plays, there are still some very tricky questions that we've still not got answers to this day. And then there's some, light and fluffy stuff that's all very entertaining, and that's good too. But what I'm really interested in is those deep questions. And then when I came back to London, I met a gentleman called Ricky Beadle Blair, who's got an MBE now, and he runs a theatre company called Team Angelica. and they're very much a BME LGBT focused theatre company. So his passion is to put voices that aren't normally on stage or don't have big voices and amplify their voices and get bigger voices. And I think it was through working with Ricky and doing political theatre that I started to become more aware of things that were going on in the world. And I was really enjoying that, but you reach a point where you think, just performing this on stage every night, but nothing's actually changing. And so I started to get more involved with politics. But incidentally, sometimes with politics, you can knock on people's doors and have one-on-one conversations, but it feels like things are moving very slowly. And you just think, someone could just create an art piece, or if someone from the community could just get people together and get them dancing or doing something collaborative, this would change people's minds. So I don't think it's either politics or art. I think there's probably that beautiful, I'm careful to use the word mystical or esoterical or even religious space in the middle that has community at its heart, that has people at its heart. And it's about power from the bottom up rather than the traditional political space, which is about that top-down power. And I think politics is moving in that direction. And I think, I said I don't want to talk about Jeremy Corbyn, but this is my second reference to him. I think the one thing he did do that was exciting was he got people involved in politics again, and community groups, and suddenly people feeling a bit more hope and vision. Now, I think it was very misguided to put that faith in Jeremy Corbyn. But at the same time, I can see what he was doing. And you look at those concerts and people cheering and singing his name. And I think there's something in there about people coming together, but I don't think it can be around a person. I think it has to be about ourselves. And I think that's something the pandemic has done, is it's given us an indication that we now have an even more shared story. And that shared story is different for different people. If you lived on a council estate, you probably found this pandemic a lot harder than someone living in, an 8 or 9 bedroom mansion somewhere. But at the same time, the pandemic has hit people who are wealthy. It's hit people who are poor. And there's now a shared story there about how vulnerable we are and how quickly the world can change. And I think that lies in between art and politics.
You've spoken about Jeremy Corbyn, spoken about Sean Bailey, spoken about Sadiq Khan. Who are the people, though, who have influenced you politically and shaped you so that thousands will be singing "Ooh, Zack Polanski" at some stage?
And that genuinely makes me cringe, which I'm hoping is a good sign of.
I'm glad it genuinely made you cringe there. But,
people voting for one of my bills would be perfect, but not singing my name unless it was beautifully sung in tune. So the first one that comes to mind is AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, in the States. I realize that's slightly avoiding the question though, because she's not been around that long. But if I'm really honest, if I'm having a moment where I'm feeling not great about the world, or even last weekend, and I'm hoping we'll talk about the policing bill and everything that happened at the vigil, at moments like that, listening to her interview and the clarity with which she speaks. And I think sometimes politics has become people avoid answering questions, or they don't give direct answers. And I just feel she's really managed to nail that. I have a very strong opinion, and if you don't like it, that's okay. We can respectfully disagree, but this is where I want to go. And then conveniently, since you mentioned the other mayoral candidates, it's totally true, but Sean Berry is on that list. You mentioned I was in the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats sent me out a lot to be a spokesperson to do hustings. Most politicians hate debate, which I always find baffles me, because it's easily the bit I love, which is knocking on doors or events like this where you can have conversations with the public. And those conversations can be difficult sometimes, but I enjoy that because you learn things. And I'm always a little bit suspicious that so many frontline politicians will do anything to avoid meeting a member of the public in case they have a difficult conversation. But anyway, so I was doing lots of debates, and one of my first debates was with Keir Starmer and Sean Berry. So, I started with 2 newbies, and I ended up debating them 30 or 40 times. And I would come home and I would say to my housemates that, Keir Starmer was not the problem. There was all this kind of hype about Keir, that he was going to be this fantastic, he wasn't an MP at this point, he was running to be MP, so it was in 2015, that he was this fantastic communicator that, had all this legalese and had this powerful charisma and presence. And I just didn't get any of that at all. He was a nice guy, I will give him that. I enjoyed chats that we would have after the kind of hustings, but there just never seemed to be any true conviction there. And I remember, for instance, once being at UCL and being asked a question about cannabis, and I was talking about that I would want it decriminalized, and he just couldn't even bring himself to say anything about it. And he got booed by a group of students. And I remember thinking, wow, he's so rigid in what he believes, but There's no kind of real value system there. Anyway, that's enough about Keir. Sian, however, was a completely different story. I would find it really awkward that I wasn't on the same team as her, in quotation marks, because very often I would give an answer and then she would give a similar answer, but she'd just have a bit more nuance to it, where I just thought, actually, that is something I believe, or actually that is something that's true. So I would nick her answer for the next time we gave a question. And I just slowly was developing this repertoire of ideas that had mainly come from Sian. And so I think when the election was finished, it was pretty clear that actually the Green Party was a natural home. Sian wasn't the only reason why I joined the Green Party, but I think her incisiveness, the way that she listens to people, and her detail on policy is incredible. She questioned the Assistant Met Commissioner yesterday at the Police and Crime Committee, and you can physically see a change when Sian comes on the screen or when she's in those committees, because they know that they are not going to get away with any, say that word, obfuscation? Is that how you say it?
Obfuscation.
There we go, said perfectly. I won't try again. Or any kind of avoiding the answer, because she will really scrutinise that. And I think that's exactly what we need from a London Assembly member and from a mayor, someone who is so up on the detail. And Sian, incidentally, represents 2/3 of the Jewish community in the UK because she is a London Assembly member. And I think she's done proud by our community and also by other communities too. So the Gypsy Roma traveller community is a community that the Green Party are talking about a lot at the moment. And I make no apology for that. And as a Jewish person, I can absolutely see how our destinies and our histories have been intertwined, not, least in the Holocaust, in terms of both our communities were treated like animals, but also the horrible tropes about being thieves and cheaters and liars. And the Jewish community have moved into a different place now where thankfully we're not subject to the same tropes, although we certainly have our own set of problematic tropes. But standing up for those vulnerable communities, even if their voting community maybe isn't as high as other communities, but still to say, actually, this is the right thing, and this is a community we're going to stand for. And I'm really proud that Jewish Greens, along with Sian's leadership, are really standing up for Gypsy Roma traveller communities and saying that you can't take away their rights to be on land. So I realise this wasn't the question. If anyone's wondering what I'm talking about, in the police and crime bill, as well as taking away our freedom to protest, there's some of the most draconian measures, I think, in our lifetimes, particularly against that community, which says, not only can they not be on private land, which incidentally is already the law, so they can't be on private land, they can't be on public land if the police deem they might be a nuisance. And that's the language. So it's not if they've committed a crime. It's not if you've caught them breaking something or fighting or whatever those kind of horrible kind of rumors about those communities are. This is just if the police think they might be annoyance, then they can seize their vehicle. But of course, this isn't just their vehicle, this is their home. So we are effectively criminalizing someone's way of life, and that's deeply unacceptable. I mean, it's so draconian that I think Putin would look at that, legislation and go, this is probably a bit much. And Boris Johnson and Priti Patel are sadly getting away with it at the moment. But anyway, that's why I support Sian.
So yesterday, we'll get on to law and order in a moment, but yesterday saw the Greens call for a Vision Zero after 100 people died on the roads last year, and a 20 mph speed limit on every TfL road with a pavement. Is that realistic? Is that going to help? What is your vision for traffic and transport?
I love talking transport. I think it's deeply realistic. So what isn't realistic is carrying on as we are, whether it's the deaths that are happening on our roads that are entirely unnecessary and increasing, or whether it's the toxic air in our city. We have nitrogen dioxide that's nearly as bad as Beijing and considerably worse than New York. We have an air pollution pandemic, and at the moment we're having a respiratory pandemic, and just all of these things are meshing into a dirty, clogged city, and it's disproportionately affecting some of the most vulnerable people in our city, whether it's the poorest people or whether it's Black and minority ethnic communities or people living on red routes. These are big dual carriageways. So we can start with that principle that we cannot continue as we are. And I noticed that Sean Bailey for the Conservatives last week acknowledged we can't continue as we are, which was really good for me to hear from a Conservative candidate, but then went on to say his solution was to make all the buses electric. Now, I'd love to see more electric vehicles, but that is not going to solve the problem. The problem is the amount of vehicles on our road, particularly private hire vehicles and Uber. So we've got to find a way to reduce traffic. Now, what's not realistic, and I think this is the presupposition behind your question, is some sort of green utopia to happen tomorrow which is where no one's driving around anymore. Everyone's on their bikes. And we've got these kind of beautiful garden bridges happening across motorways. And we're turning all our parking spaces into green parks, and everyone's, having picnics. As I'm describing it, I think this is a really nice vision of the future for the city. But I appreciate that it's not realistic. And if we go out campaigning for that, people are not going to be there yet. I think what is realistic, though, and actually people are crying out for, and I think communities are there quicker than politicians at the moment, is to start saying we need to look at a way of reducing vehicle traffic. And one of our key policies is the idea of a smart, privacy-friendly road pricing system. And this would be the idea that the polluter pays. And what I mean by that is depending on the age of your car, the emissions of your car, the miles you drive and where you drive, that depends on how much you pay. Now, we've already seen this happen in lots of other cities where this has been successful. So this isn't even some kind of radical, crazy idea. This has been demonstrated already. And a moment I loved in the London Assembly a few months ago was Sadiq Khan challenged Caroline Russell, one of our Assembly members, on this idea and said, where else is this happening? And she very quickly, without missing a beat, ran through a whole list of cities where this has been very successful. However, I do accept the challenge that these cities are not London. And London has unique challenges. We're a huge city and we're very dependent, or have been very dependent, on our roads. So we've got to start reducing that dependency. And I think there's lots of ways to do that. One way is to have better public transport. Now, in the inner city of London, if we're talking zones 1 to 3 or even 1 to 4, we're almost there. I'd say we've got a pretty good bus route. We've got good tube links. And also the cycle lanes are almost getting there, although Kensington and Chelsea, that's a separate subject. I could talk about at length about the cycle lanes, but I won't have people switch off in droves, so I'll leave that there. The outer boroughs, though, we're not there yet. So it's not realistic to expect people not to use their cars and start using bikes. So we've got to have safe cycling infrastructure for a start. That means segregated cycle lanes. That means pavements. That means reducing vehicle traffic. And I think it's all of these things in combination that means we can start to really challenge our air pollution emergency. It's almost like you want two manifestos. You want the manifesto for what Sian Berry will do as mayor in 50 days on her first day as mayor, and then what Sian Berry 4 years later, when she's taking a second or hopefully third term, would then do. And I think when you try and talk about that third term in 2021, I don't know what year it is, that's unrealistic. But I think when people can hear that actually there's a pattern to this, and there's a way of saying, let's look at where we're at now, let's take the low-hanging fruit and the sensible measures we can take, and then let's start doing the more radical measures that our city so desperately needs in 5-10 years' time, when we can take people with us.
And we will be beating our swords into plowshares and turning our car parks into picnic grounds.
I'd love to see some more picnic grounds. I think the plowshares maybe is stretched too far. I don't think we necessarily need to become sort of agricultural Philistines or Luddites. But I do think that realistic private vehicles at the moment, the way they are polluting our environment when we have a climate emergency, we need to reduce our emissions. Global warming is looking like we're going to be hitting that 4-degree threshold. That means whole areas of Africa being uninhabitable. It means Bangladesh underwater. It means all of the scare stories we hear all the time. And I try not to go into those because I much prefer to focus on the hopeful things. Because I think if you do too much of a doom and gloom, you just lose people. But I think we also need to be realistic, where 97% of the scientific community are in consensus that we are facing a climate emergency and we have huge air pollution issues. And I think we've got to take that on board and say, how do we reduce that? And this can't be top down. It can't be politicians telling people what to do. It has to be about community. And I actually think, I joke about the picnics, but actually picnics, there's some truth in that. We're talking about community again. And I think the only answer to all of these complex problems are going to be people coming together. And that's Londoners from the Jewish community, from the Muslim community. It's people of no faith. It's humanists. It's the elderly population, it's the young people, it's the disabled people, it's the LGBT groups. It's all of these groups coming together and saying, actually, global problems require global solutions. And we can only reach those global solutions by you, me, our next door neighbors, the people we love, and our family all coming together. And if that sounds hopeful and if that sounds visionary, I make no apology for that, because the world's pretty grim at the moment and we've got to turn things around. And I think we can only do that together.
So when I was at school, the topics that we're talking about now were peripheral, and climate change and rights and the gender politics that is now very much part of the heart of discussion was something that was way off on the fringe. So I would hate to be dismissive of your articulation of dreams today as being something that won't be part of the mainstream thoughts of tomorrow. But always at the heart of political debate has been safer streets. Last week, Sean Bailey said that we should increase stop and search. It was a way to counter the drugs trade, country lines, knife crime. Green policy is against stop and search, as I understand it, and banning facial recognition cameras, though you've just said that it's going to be necessary for tracking our cars to see where we're going and what our mileage is and what zones we're in. So my face will remain hidden, but I will be able to be tracked by my number plate. I'll let you resolve that one. But just on the law and order, if you stop the police powers, isn't that going to make us less safe?
So I think there's two challenges there, and I want to take the first one very quickly, which is on the facial recognition stuff. So it's clear that it needs to be a privacy-friendly smart road pricing plan. So that means that there's very clear data controls about who has that information, and that must not leak to insurance companies, must not leak to our police force. It's there for a very particular reason. And I think we need to get that baked in straight away, because I think smart road pricing isn't an if, it's a when. It is going to happen. I think even the Conservative mayor might bring it in 8, 12 years' time, because there's just no other way that our system is going to work with the amount of traffic we've got on the streets. And every way that we're going, whether it's through Ken Livingstone, Boris Johnson, or Sadiq Khan, has all been moving towards this system. I think it's just about a mayor brave enough to go, okay, it's time to do this. So I think it's important to be having these conversations now about how privacy friendly it is, or that is a huge problem that's waiting to get to us. On stop and search is politically and society incoherent. It doesn't even achieve the very aims it sets out to do. The Independent Police Authority, when they look at it, says that stop and search does not reduce knife crime. It does not even necessarily reduce violent crime. The only thing it does do is catch youngsters with cannabis. Now, I've spoken at length on LBC and on the TV about the problem about drugs in our society and the criminalization of drugs. Essentially, what it's doing is it's taking young people into the criminal justice system, giving them a criminal record that's completely unnecessary, labeling them as a criminal, and then they're in this kind of vicious circle of crime. And what we really need to be doing is taking a public health approach on this. And again, this isn't something that Greens have just dreamt up. This has happened in lots of cities successfully. One not a million miles away from England, which is Glasgow, they have taken this approach around knife crime and actually found a huge reduction in knife crime when they stopped seeing it as a criminal issue. Although, of course, if someone's stabbing someone with a knife, that has to be criminal. But in terms of preventative measures, looking at it as a public health issue. Now, with stop and search, this is disproportionately affecting young Black people. And it's not even like the statistics are close. It's something like 9 times more likely as a young Black man to be stopped and searched in London than one of your white peers. Yet your white peer, I think, is 6 times more likely to be carrying a drug. Those statistics are staggering, and they just haven't been talked about for so long. And I think all we're doing is exacerbating tensions that already exist between our minority communities and the police. Now, I'm not saying we should get rid of the police force altogether. We clearly need to be feeling like we're safe. And I've certainly had instances in my life where I've been glad of a police officer there. My younger brother, for instance, in Regent's Park, just last year rock was thrown at his head. A police officer took him in a car and they drove around Regent's Park looking for the perpetrator. And he had nothing but praise for the police officers who took him there. However, we do have a problem in the police force with institutional racism. Now, that's not, again, to say that there aren't individual police officers who are doing a marvelous job and that the police force generally is something we should be supporting. We absolutely should, and they keep us safe and they deserve to be kept safe too. But we really need to stop as a community and say, we can't carry on like this. And this is just unacceptable. And the idea that the police at the moment need more powers, when we saw what happened last Saturday, or we see even other instances of disproportionate policing, is horrifying to me. Now, the Conservatives are trying to hide this by saying this policing bill is all about people who assault emergency workers or people who spit at emergency workers. It is already an offence to assault emergency workers. It's already an offence to spit an emergency worker. And I want to be very clear, anyone who assaults or spits an emergency worker, or indeed any worker, emergency or not, needs to feel the full force of the law. That is completely unacceptable. And that is something that people should be punished for, although I believe that an education piece should come beforehand so we can avoid those things happening. But if that doesn't work, then it's not that no one should be punished. However, they're covering many more draconian laws under the cover of that. For instance, stopping our freedom to protest. So the question about policing is a huge question. I can go in lots of directions. So I guess I'll pause so you can ask another more specific question about it. But I think the general point is this, is that we need to protect our police force, and we need to thank our police force for what they do. But we also need to recognize that with power comes responsibility. And Robert Peel, a long time ago, had the Peel principles, which are the first principles of policing. And the most important one is people are the police and police are the people. And what that means is the police should only people by consent. And it's clear to me at vigils on Saturday, they were not policing with consent. And this is happening far too often in our city. So we need to look at how do the police with consent. And crucially, I think the statistic is trust in the police is at 57%. That is shockingly low. That's almost as bad as politicians. And then they're some of the worst on earth. So I think we need to look at quite seriously what has gone so wrong with trust in communities and trust in the police.
You're talking about instilling faith in police, but I see The Art of Disruption sitting on the shelf behind you. You recently joined the picket line for the Barnet Sage nursing home workers. Why were they striking?
So the book, I should say, is by author. I know, it's a fantastic book. I should plug it. It's by Majid, who was a Green MEP, and now runs a refugee charity in Sheffield. And it's a fantastic book, and I thoroughly recommend it. And I think disruption is massively important to politics. I think disruption should all be about politics, because otherwise you're just doing the status quo. And until you get to your utopia, which then, sure, keep the status quo if everyone's happy and everyone's included and everyone feels fulfilled and everyone's challenged in the same ways, then there's no need for disruption. But until then, I think we need to keep disrupting. The Sage Care Home Workers is one of the pieces of work I'm most proud of in my political life. This is a group of workers who were working at a Jewish care home in Barnet, the Sage Care Home, and they've been paid a poverty wage. So they're being paid something like £9 to £10 an hour, depending on their position. To put it in context, these workers have been working throughout the pandemic. They have not missed a day's work, and they've been looking after older people from our community, some of the most vulnerable people. And when I've spoken to those older people, they love these care workers. They don't have enough praise for how much these people have looked after them and their families. And this group of people are all international migrants from Eritrea, Somalia, Spain, France, Germany, Australia, and from all over the world. And they're an incredible, vibrant group of people that when you speak to them, clearly love their jobs and love the older people they look after. So they spoke to their employees and they said, we want to unionize, we want to get together, and we actually want to be paid a living wage. And the bosses of the care home, which incidentally have reserves of £3.1 billion, said that they could have some pizza. And they offered them some pizza as a compensation for how hard they're working. Now, I don't need to say this is deeply insulting. And I just want to take something head on here as well, is that the Labour Party in the area, when they were asked to get involved, the councillors, they said they weren't going to get involved because their campaign was deeply anti-Semitic. So I challenged the councillors. I said, what about the campaign is anti-Semitic other than it's a Jewish care home? And they said that we're talking about the fact they're billionaires. And to me, there's a deeply embedded problematic anti-Semitism in a Labour Party who are now so concerned to talk about the Jewish community that they feel they cannot talk about there being any wealth in the Jewish community because that will be deemed as anti-Semitic. So there's all sorts of things to unravel there, but it's very clear to me that the campaign went nowhere near anti-Semitism. And in fact, on the Sabbath, they stopped making any noise on the strike out of respect for our Jewish community. So I think they've gone above and beyond to make sure that they're being respectful to our culture and our community. And I'm sure it goes without saying that I would not have associated myself with those workers or that campaign if I'd even sniffed a moment of anti-Semitism. Anyway, back to the point. So they offered them pizza. They said no, and then they've unionized, and now they're asking for a living wage. That's currently in negotiations, and it's going back and forth. And I'm hopeful for it, but I'm slightly ashamed. I can't be ashamed for our community because they clearly don't represent us. They certainly don't represent me. But I just think that, again, we're a community that value ourselves on love and compassion, on community, on respect, on even the idea of mitzvah, the idea of being thankful for something or doing something just because it's right, not even because you have a love for it or because it's your passion, but actually because it's the right thing to do. And I've tried to communicate with the owners of the care home that I don't want them to do it because they feel I'm bullying them. I don't want them to do it because I went on ITV and spoke about why they should do it. I want them to do it because it's the right thing to do, and they could be the heroes of this story. They could walk away, and because their argument, by the way, is that no other care homes pay that much, and they think it's dangerous to set a precedent because then all the care homes will have to do it. I think it's a ridiculous argument. Setting a precedent would be the most beautiful and most valued leadership quality they could take to demonstrate to the rest of the UK, to all the care sectors, and indeed the NHS, and say, actually, we value the people who look after us while we've been in a pandemic. We value the people that have been looking after us, that have been on the front line and putting their own lives on the risk. And they could do that. And currently they aren't. So I'd encourage people to write to Sage Care Home. Even if you don't vote Green, just say that, you heard a Green speak about it and you just think it's something they should do. I should say I would love you to vote Green. That's my first time saying that in this hour. But even if you don't, I would love you to write to the Sage Care Home workers.
You speak passionately about people who work hard for meager return, as any jobbing actor would speak. Green policy is one which is going to challenge people who are in, for example, the mining industry. Here, Cumbria, people who are involved in very manual labor. It's what they are able to do because of how they have grown up. And I know the planet is on a knife edge and we've got to make change, but in fact, policies against mining really risk just exporting the jobs to China, undermining our own economy, doing people out of jobs here, and the planet's going to get warmer even so. What's the reality check and how do we support home industry?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I'm not going to pretend it's easy. I think another example, and then I'll come back to mining, is Uber. Uber are a highly problematic company that don't support their workers in the ways that they should, and also are clearly emitting lots of carbon emissions in our city. Yeah, I do support Uber workers. These are often vulnerable, marginalized communities who are just trying to make a living for themselves, for their children, and for their family. So, I grapple with these ideas on a daily basis that, it would be very privileged and idealistic to say, let's take away all of these people's jobs and just again have this green utopia. Having said that, I slightly reject your question when you say the planet will warm anyway. The planet will only warm as long as governments, institutions, and corporations do not take action. Now, I'm vegan, so I really believe in the power of individual responsibility. And speaking to anyone, I would encourage them to be vegan. However, I accept that me being vegan, or anyone on this call being vegan, is not going to stop the planet warming on its own. The way that we're going to get change is through systemic change, it's through bigger changes. It's through governments primarily, but also businesses, organizations, corporates leading the way. So the planet doesn't need to warm. That's not an inevitability. That is something that we can reverse, and it's something we can slow down. The time for that window is very, very small. People are saying it's literally in the next year or two. Because of feedback loops, it means even once we've reduced our emissions to net zero, there's still consequences of the fact we've been doing this for so long that mean emissions will still continue to rise for a short amount of time. However, we did see during the pandemic how life can be different, how you can hear birds singing, how our streets can be empty, how people don't get killed by vehicle traffic, how our air can feel clearer. All of those things, we've now had a taste of how different our world can be. And I think when people tap into that, they will realize that these changes will make the difference. Now, I'm not avoiding the question. So then we've got to talk about mining. We've got to talk about these industries, delivery drivers, all of those sorts of things. It has to be a just transition. There's no environmental justice without social, racial, and economic justice too. So we've got to make sure that when we're talking about the environment, we're also making sure that we're caring for our communities. However, that doesn't mean lying to people. So that doesn't mean pretending that mining can continue. It doesn't mean pretending that we can continue to extract fossil fuels from the earth, that fracking could have carried on, and that everything will be okay. It doesn't mean pretending that Uber is going to be the way to get us out of our road traffic and air pollution crisis. It's about being very honest with people and saying the mining industry is going to have to go. We're going to need to shut down City Airport. We're going to have to look at the aviation industry and make it incredibly expensive to fly. and start putting on a flight tax. So for instance, every time someone flies, it gets more and more expensive. So those small 20% of people who are taking 80% of the flights are paying through the roof for those aviation emissions. So actually those can start to come down too. But then we've got to look at what are the alternative jobs. And here's the great bit about the Green New Deal. It gives us the answer on a plate. We need to bring about new industries. We need to have renewable industries. We need to have renewable energies. We need to retrofit our homes. We need to have those safer streets we were talking about. All of those things are going to bring about jobs. They're going to bring about industry and they're going to bring about money. Being a green does not mean rejecting capitalism. It does not mean rejecting any idea of growth. It's about making sure let's have positive growth. Let's make sure that those things that are growing are beneficial for our society, our community, and the people we love and the people around us. It's about supporting independent business, about supporting community, not supporting big conglomerates. And all of those things can happen. But ultimately, we've got to win the argument that, first of all, we need to recognize the earth cannot continue how it is. Now, just finally, because I've spoken for a long time, China. People bring up China all the time. They say, why are you doing all of this when China is the problem? And I agree, there's huge amounts of problem with what's going on in China at the moment. There's huge amounts of problems on human rights abuses. There's huge amounts of problems on carbon emissions. But also we need to recognize that a lot of that is our problem in the West. We are shipping over landfill to China and India, and we're pretending that our carbon emissions are down when really we're just pushing the problem elsewhere. So first of all, we've got to take responsibility for all of our emissions. But also we've got to take responsibility for where we live and our community, whether that's for people who live in my house share, whether that's for people who live on my street, or more to the point with the politics I do, whether that's people right across London. Now, the scale of difference that you take responsibility for is going to depend on your position in life, where you feel right now, where your well-being is right now. As a rabbi, for instance, you take on a huge responsibility for almost everyone. People on this call might just want to take responsibility for themselves, their son or daughter, their brother or sister, and all of that is fine too. But we've all got to take responsibility for the things we can change. I can't take responsibility for China. There's not a huge amount I can do. If I can resolve all the issues in the UK and have a perfect green government with Caroline Lucas as Prime Minister, I'll take a cabinet job for arts and culture or something like that. We can sort out lots of problems. Then I can start to talk about China. But right now, the UK is in a horrible mess when it comes to our carbon emissions. So I think we need to clean up home first, and then we can talk about what's going on, in the East.
So we had a few wonderful, delightful months of listening to birdsong, and goats invaded some towns where they hadn't been seen for a while. But at the same time, the theatres were closed. There was no life in our streets and in our high streets. Actors had nothing to do. Our tourism economy has absolutely tanked. And you start putting prices, tariffs on flying. Our tourism industry is gone completely. No one's going to be able to get into the theatres. How are you going to make London recover on the London Assembly? You sound like you're going to shut it down.
I love this question. And also it's something that is going to be, if I'm elected in 50 days time, which I hope to be, this will easily be the biggest challenge. And it's just interesting how life can change, because we could have had this conversation a year ago and I could have been talking about a whole different set of things. But realistically, how we recover from the pandemic, this will be a 3-year term, not a 4-year term, is going to dominate every single meeting. But it's something I'm massively passionate to do. And that comes largely from being an actor. I have friends, family members who are musicians, actors, singers, dancers. I see how their livelihoods have just been ripped from them, and it feels like there's no hope. Having said all of that, I think a story that's been missed by the media is how much resilience there is among artists. There are things going on. Even while I've been campaigning as an actor, I've been doing a virtual show online called Eco Chambers. This isn't a plug for it necessarily, it's done now. But it's a show, environmentalist show about politics, a digital artist performance. So it's been very brand on me for me to do this. But actually, it's been fascinating saying, where is the resilience in our communities? Where is the resilience as artists? When suddenly we can't do things the way that we always did them, how do we find to do things differently? And if I'm really honest, I'm more passionate about the theatre than anything else, but so much theatre was so boring. It becomes so staid. I love Shakespeare, but so often you see it and no one's present. There's no authenticity in the performance, with some rare examples. And I just really hope that actually everything's been given a shake up. So actually when we get back to performing, we start to say, what stories do we really need to tell now? If this story doesn't require an immediate action from the audience to go change the world or change some aspect of their life, Why are we telling it? Like, is it necessary just for historical purpose, or actually is there a relevance to it today? However, on your issue of taxes, I think if our tourism industry in London requires us to pollute the environment, it requires us to destroy our earth, then we don't deserve that tourist industry. We need to find a way that we can operate within our means. So the first obvious thing is looking at how can the UK be more appealing to UK citizens. I hate this phrase, staycation. We've heard it throughout the pandemic. It's not a staycation if you go to Cornwall, it's a holiday. And it's this idea that the airline companies have pumped for so long that you're not really going on holiday unless you're jumping on a plane and you're flying somewhere and emitting. I think we really need to look in Europe. Admittedly, it's not a great time for more Europe kind of unity, but I think we clearly need it. Looking at actually how can we make our train systems more affordable? How can we make sure that we can get around Europe to some of the most beautiful places on our doorstep in an affordable and speedy way? And we can do that. It's been proven. Part of the problem is that certain countries putting up their tariffs or charging way more for their railway lines for the train companies than they need to. It clearly needs global leadership and everyone to get together and say, actually, how fantastic would it be to have a genuine European railway system where you can get anywhere, where there's good stations, where you feel safe, where it's well lit, and crucially, that it's affordable. Lisbon is one of my favorite places in the world to go visit. It's about 60 quid on EasyJet, and I do everything I can to make sure I get the train. But really, you're looking at a 2-day, 3-day trip, and it's going to cost 400, 500 pounds as opposed to 60 quid. Now, I don't judge people who get the flight. I understand they're working hard in their jobs and they maybe only have a few days holiday and they don't want to spend those few days traveling. So the blame cannot be about self-righteousness. You need to be better at this. What we need to do is look at those people at the top and say, actually, how can we make this work for our communities? And actually, if we're taxing people, we need to be taxing the polluters. We need to be taxing the people who aren't running proper services that serve the community. It's an old tired trope, but we need to make it for people again. And that's only tired because I think it's the truest thing in the world that's been true. It's been true throughout the generations, throughout tribes, throughout native groups, and throughout communities and democracy. Democracy has to be for the people. And if it's not for the people, then it's time for the people to take over. And I don't necessarily mean bloody revolution. I'm talking about peaceful democracy that's engaged in our communities.
So as part of your peaceful engaged democracy, you were arrested in April 2019 as a part of Extinction Rebellion. And you said you were proud to have played your part. And what gives you the right to disrupt people's lives and make their work harder?
I think a lot gives me the right, the same thing that gives you the right, or anyone on this call, that actually, if you see that someone is committing a crime in the street, then it is your prerogative. In fact, it is your duty to stop them committing that crime. If you see someone...
What about people trying to get to work and the trains being stopped in front of them, you know, encouraging people to give up school?
I feel like you're channeling your best LBC presenter here, Rabbi, but I don't quite believe you. Even as I hear it through your voice, I think he doesn't really believe that. So with the first part of your question, though, which I do agree with, I think stopping trains getting people to work is really counterproductive. And I was very vocal against Extinction Rebellion when they stopped the DLR, particularly in an area that has a very working class community. I think it was unimaginably tone deaf and people weren't thinking through what they did. Again, the problem with Extinction Rebellion is there's no leadership. So people can do things and say they're representing Extinction Rebellion and off they go, and there's not a lot you can do about it. So just to be really clear, when I say I'm proud of what I did, I'm proud that I very peacefully, singing, talking to people, giving speeches and engaging with police officers productively, sat on Waterloo Bridge and apologized to the people that I was delaying and explained that I was doing this for their children, for their grandchildren. And actually, you know, I won't lie and say everyone agreed with it, but I would say 99.9% of people, even if they weren't happy about it, got the point. And those are 0.1% of people who, you know, used a choice group of words and weren't particularly happy with me. But ultimately, if you see someone abusing an animal in the street, you know, shouting at a dog, there's a few things you can do. You can shout at the dog too. That's clearly not acceptable. And that's, you know, essentially polluting and allowing things to continue. You can walk away and pretend it's not happening. And I think that's where the Labour Party kind of are at. They say, you know, yeah, we need to deal with the environment and the green stuff, but they're not offering the solutions. Or what you really need to do is take the stick away from the person who's beating the dog and actually take some action on it. And I think that's what Extinction Rebellion had at its heart. It was about saying, along with the school strikers and David Attenborough, the earth is being destroyed. We are destroying it, and we need to sound the alarm. Now, I think where Extinction Rebellion and the Green Party are different, Extinction Rebellion is sounding the alarm, but it's not enough to sound the alarm. And that's, somewhere I differ from Extinction Rebellion. I don't think it's enough to line the road. I don't think it's enough just to get arrested for arrested's sake. But what it did do was make it frontline and center in the media. For days and days and days, I did nothing but tour TV studios and radio stations, as did other Green people. And the first round, all they wanted to talk about was protest and was what we were doing right. And that felt counterproductive because I just felt like the conversation was about us and what we were doing. But the second time round, it was so interesting to hear the language the presenters were using. They were saying, everyone knows there's a climate emergency. Why are you still, standing in the street? The problem is, what are we going to do about it? And I just realized that there'd been a huge change in a year, that suddenly it was accepted just as a common narrative that there was a problem. And the question now was, what are we going to do about it? And what are we going to do about it is where we don't necessarily need Extinction Rebellion, in my opinion. That's where the Green Party come in, because actually we already have a party who are almost a political wing of Extinction Rebellion, who are saying, actually, there's some very definite policies we have here that can improve our lives and our community. And there's a graphic that Caroline Lucas loves to tweet out. It seems every 5 minutes, but it's brilliant. It's a conference of climate change deniers. And one of them puts their hand up and says, what if climate change is a hoax, though? What happens if we get more equality, better air, better jobs, more renewable industries, and a better feeling of community? And all of it has been for nothing. And I think that translates so well why the green agenda is so important, even if you don't think the environment is the most important thing in the world. Just for its social justice aims in itself, it's vitally important that people vote for Green and vote for Sean Barry.
Housing and homelessness.
Big subject. So homelessness.
Short answer. Housing and homelessness.
A short answer, did you say?
Yeah.
Let's get homeless people homes would be the short answer. There's tens of thousands of empty buildings in central London. There are less homeless people in the street. I don't think it takes a genius to work out that no one should have to sleep at night without a roof above their head or without a warm meal. We absolutely need to make sure that it is essential that one of our number one priorities is to get people into homes. And those people who do have homes...
How's it going to happen?
That's going to happen by absolutely making sure that existing homes that we have, that we retrofit so they're well insulated, that we stop this obsession with demolishing homes and building bigger buildings that then get bought by foreign investors who don't live there. It's about making sure that we have a social housing revolution. So we stop kicking people out of social housing. We stop stigmatizing social housing. And we actually get to a point where we let go of Thatcherism and this obsession that we have to own our own home, that actually people are proud of the home that they rent. And if people want to own a home, that's okay. I'm not saying people shouldn't have ambition, but I don't think it should be a marker of your self-worth that you've not got anywhere unless you own a home. And I house share with 20 people actually in an old hospital. I'm a property guardian, and I love the sense of community we have at our home. Will I want to do it in 10, 20 years? No, probably not. Probably want to live with my boyfriend on a boat somewhere or something like that. But for this period of time, I love where I live. And I think we need to end this obsession with you failed at life unless you own a home.
How are we going to pay for it?
So a big way we can pay for it actually is looking at the borrowing, the savings we're going to make on energy costs. So by insulating those homes, we're already saving a huge amount. And actually, if you can start to invest some of the things that you're going to save through borrowing, Sean Berry has already demonstrated in the last budget amendment how you can do that. In fact, she found £50 million for Sadiq Khan that was just lying around through using this exact technique. And one thing she's also really pushed him on is estate ballots. This is the idea that if you live in a social home and they're going to redevelop your home by blowing it up and putting a new home there, you should ask the people first. So she pushed him for years to make sure that actually people are given the choice whether their home should be destroyed or not. In credit to Sadiq Khan, he eventually said yes 2 years later. However, to his shame, he pushed 36 estates through the day before he agreed to this. That is extremely cynical, and I think a measure of how Sadiq Khan has done some good things, but actually as a mayor on housing, I think he's been an abject failure actually, and it's something he really needs to be held on, to account onto in this election.
2 seats in the council at the moment, in the assembly at the moment. How many are you going to have in May?
I've always told not to talk about numbers because you just get expectation. But I'm not a regular politician, so I think we're going to get 3 seats. I think I'm going to get elected, and you can run this tape if I don't for the rest of my life, and I'll have to eat humble pie, and I'm okay with that. Sometimes you lose elections, but I think the more that I've been out on the streets and the more that we've been phone banking and speaking to people, the amount of times I'm hearing, I've never even thought about voting Green and you have my vote. that's coming from both Labour voters and Conservative voters. And I think that's why we're going to get the third seat, because we've not just got Labour voters coming to us and not just Conservative voters. There's an array of people who are actually saying, I didn't vote Green for a long time because there was a stereotype that they all needed a shower and that there were hippies and all of those kind of old things. And I'm not disparaging that. I think there's a beautiful radical movement within the Greens. But I think frequently people see Sean Berry, they see Caroline Russell, Caroline Lucas. They see a professionalism to the Greens now and a maturity that actually says, we understand if we're going to make these big policies, we need to know how we're going to pay for them. We need to be able to come to those spaces and handle the bureaucracy. We need to be able to handle ourselves professionally in political spaces. And I think we've proved that time and time again. If you ask my campaign team, they'll say we're going to get 4 seats because they're feeling particularly enthusiastic right now. I think 4 seats is going to be a huge push. But I'd be lying if I didn't say that I won't be disappointed if we don't get that third seat.
3 out of 25, 4 out of 25. What difference are you going to make?
Makes a huge difference. 4 in particular would actually mean we probably hold the balance of power on the assembly. Now, assembly members don't hold a huge amount of power, generally hard power. They have a lot of soft power, so the media are interested in talking to them. You can really get items on the agenda, and I think that's the biggest thing I'd be doing, particularly for our Jewish community, actually, making sure that I was a vocal voice to represent some Jewish people in the community. I'm sure not everyone would agree with me all the time. But actually, the biggest thing is the mayor cannot get a budget through without a majority on the assembly. And actually, it looks like the Labour Conservative group might be very balanced. So actually, it's going to be for a mayor, if it's not a Green mayor, to turn to the Greens and say, I need your votes for that budget. And we're going to say, we'll love to vote for your budget, but here's some things that you're going to need to agree on. And we'll have made sure that those things have been agreed by the people we represent.
So you stood for Westminster, now you're standing for London. Which stage are you planning to strut and to fret your hour upon ultimately?
Which stage?
Are you planning to strut and fret your hour upon? Yeah.
Oh, I see. I think about this a lot because I sometimes think, where is this going and at what point do I want to get back into acting? And I think the truth really is at the moment, just want to focus on being a London Assembly member. And if I make it to the London Assembly, then at least for a year or two, there won't be kind of doing other jobs because I think the job will absolutely be.
And then Parliament.
I'd love to be an MP, so I've got no kind of bones about that. But sadly, we live in a first past the post system. And I talk frequently, probably more than anything, about how we need a fair voting system of proportional representation. I think until we get a system of PR, getting more Green MPs in London is going to be a very difficult feat. However, I'll keep going at it. And it doesn't mean that, I won't fight hard for it. But I'm realistic about things. And I know that sometimes if the odds are stacked so against you and the system is so unfair, then you really need to focus on where you can make a difference. And somewhere Greens can absolutely win and make a huge difference is on the London Assembly. So the biggest message actually I give people watching this call is even if you don't necessarily vote Green for Parliament, or you don't even necessarily vote Green in your local elections, if you've enjoyed the things that I've said today, voting Green for the London Assembly is a proportional system. So it's not first past the post. It means that every vote counts no matter where you are in London. And voting Green on that ballot paper in 50 days' time will actually be a vote that takes me to the London Assembly. And I thank you very much in advance.
So I think Zack Polanski is definitely a name to watch.
Thank you.
A couple of questions have been fed to me and I've fed them on to you. Otherwise, it's been quite quiet. And I think that's because people have enjoyed listening to you.
Hopefully not asleep.
That or they've all fallen asleep behind their dark screens. But I thank you for your engaging humor, your frank answers, your cogent and well thought out ideas, and your passion. I wish you all success and thanks for joining us this evening.
Can I say how much I enjoyed the interview too? That sounds like a very politician thing to say, but I think everyone on the call will recognize when you give someone a space to answer a question and don't keep interrupting them, as has become our political culture, it actually ends up in a better conversation with a more enlightening discourse. So thank you for all that you do. And I'll be watching the next interviews too. Right. So please do join us on Monday evening. That's just after the weekend, Monday evening, 8 p.m. when I will be talking to Louisa Part. So thank you very much, Zack.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.